October 1977. Studio One, NBC Burbank. The red light on camera 2 burned steady, and somewhere in 30 million American living rooms, the evening had officially begun. Johnny Carson sat behind the desk, a cigarette balanced in the ashtray to his right, his posture suggesting neither anticipation nor indifference, just the practiced stillness of a man who'd done this 4,000 times before. The guest chair sat empty under a pool of white light. In the wings, a woman in a pale gown waited, her guitar case leaning against the wall, her blonde hair catching the stage floods like spun glass. Dolly Parton had been on television before. She had sung on variety shows, appeared on talk circuits, charmed audiences with her voice and her self-deprecating humor. But this was different. This was The Tonight Show. This was Johnny Carson. And in 1977, that meant something closer to a national examination than an interview. By the mid-1970s, Johnny Carson had become something more than a television host. He had become a gatekeeper, a validator, a figure whose approval could lift a career into orbit, or whose silence could leave it stranded in obscurity. To sit in that guest chair was to submit to a kind of public audition, not for talent was assumed, but for likability, for authenticity, for the indefinable quality that made America decide whether to let you into their homes again. Carson did not grant this power through force or spectacle. He granted it through restraint. He listened. He smiled. He waited. And in those pauses, careers were made or gently, almost invisibly, dismissed. Dolly Parton understood this. She had spent years navigating the country music industry, a world that judged women with particular cruelty, that dismissed her appearance while underestimating her intelligence, that assumed the wigs and the rhinestones and the exaggerated femininity were the entirety of the performance. She had learning to turn that underestimation into advantage, to play the role they expected while quietly controlling every detail of her career, her publishing rights, her image. But Johnny Carson was different. He was not Nashville. He was America. And America, in 1977, still did not quite know what to make of a woman who looked like Dolly Parton and thought like a CEO. The interview began as they often did, with Johnny's monologue trailing into introduction, with the band rising into fanfare, with Dolly entering to applause that was warm but cautious, the kind of applause that waits to see if it will be justified. She sat down, crossed her legs, smiled with the kind of radiance that seemed both effortless and meticulously constructed. Johnny leaned back, his eyes bright with the particular brand of curiosity he reserved for guests he found genuinely interesting. He asked about her childhood in Tennessee, about the one-room cabin, about growing up in a family of 12 children. She answered with stories she had told before, but the telling was fresh, the details vivid. Mud on the floor, newspapers for wallpaper, a mother who sewed quilts from fabric scraps. She did not perform poverty for sympathy. She performed it as fact, as context, as the foundation of everything that came after. And then, as the interview deepened, something shifted. Johnny Carson, who had built his career on control, on the carefully modulated rhythm of question and response, began to relax in a way that was visible even to the audience. He laughed, not the polite chuckle of a professional host, but something warmer, something genuine. Dolly Parton was funny. Not funny in the way that guests tried to be funny for Johnny, chasing his approval with rehearsed anecdotes, but funny in the way that suggested she was simply being herself, that the humor was inseparable from the intelligence, that she had understood long ago that if people were going to look at her, she might as well give them something to see. She talked about her appearance with a directness that disarmed. She joked about her wigs, her figure, the way people reacted to her before they heard her speak. She turned the assumptions into material, into comedy. But there was no self-hatred in it, no apology. She was not asking for permission to look the way she looked. She was simply acknowledging reality and moving forward. Johnny listened, and in his listening there was something close to respect, a recognition that the woman across from him was not playing a character, but had become, through years of discipline and calculation, exactly who she had decided to be. The desk sat between them, that familiar expanse of wood and metal that had framed 10,000 conversations, that represented the boundary between host and guest, between America and the person auditioning for its affection. Johnny's hand rested on it, fingers drumming lightly, a small gesture that signaled ease. The microphone stood to his left, the boom angled down, its presence so ordinary that it had become invisible, except that it wasn't. It was always there, always listening, always carrying every word, every laugh, every pause into the homes of an audience that numbered in the tens of millions. That microphone was the instrument of transformation, the device that turned private conversation into public ritual, that made intimacy a broadcast event. And then, without warning, without any shift in tone that would have signaled intention, Johnny Carson leaned forward and kissed Dolly Parton. It was not rehearsed. It was not discussed. It happened in the space between one sentence and the next, a gesture that might have been read as affectionate or playful or presumptuous, depending on who was watching and what they brought to the moment. The audience gasped, then laughed, then applauded, unsure perhaps of what they had just witnessed, but certain that it was something worth reacting to. Dolly did not pull back. She did not recoil or scold or perform outrage. She smiled, wide and knowing, and said something that made Johnny laugh again, something that turned the moment into comedy, into shared absurdity, into a story that would be told and retold for decades. But what the audience saw was not what happened, or rather, what the audience saw was the surface, and the surface was only part of the truth. Because in that moment, on live television with 30 million people watching, Dolly Parton made a choice. She could have reacted with anger, with discomfort, with the kind of public rejection that would have humiliated Johnny Carson in a way he had never been humiliated. She could have walked off the set, could have used the moment to assert her boundaries, to make a statement about respect and autonomy, and the way men in power assume access to women's bodies without asking. But she did not. She laughed. She turned it into a joke. She allowed Johnny to save face, to remain the beloved figure America trusted, the man who could do no wrong because he never seemed to take himself too seriously. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, Dolly Parton would talk about that moment with the same clarity she brought to everything else. She did not claim to have been traumatized. She did not describe it as assault or violation. She described it as something more complicated, a moment of surprise, of slight discomfort, of a decision made in real time about how to respond, about what would serve her career and her image and her long-term goals better than any alternative. She had been kissed by Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. She could have made him the villain. Instead, she made him the fan, and in doing so, she retained control of the narrative, of the story that would be told about her, of the way America would remember her appearance on the most important television show in the country. This was the invisible work of being Dolly Parton. The wigs and the gowns and the rhinestones were the visible part, the part people focused on, the part that made them underestimate her. But beneath that surface was a mind that calculated probabilities, that understood power dynamics, that knew when to assert and when to deflect, when to fight and when to let the moment pass. Johnny Carson had power. He had the desk, the microphone, the audience, the platform, but Dolly Parton had something else. She had the ability to turn any moment into her moment, to take whatever happened and shape it into the story she wanted to tell. The interview continued. They talked about her music, about her ambitions, about her plans to cross over from country to pop, to become not just a regional star, but a national one, an international one. Johnny listened, and in his questions there was genuine interest, the kind of interest that went beyond the superficial, that suggested he understood he was talking to someone who would outlast the trends, who would still be relevant when the culture had moved on to other concerns. The applause sign blinked on cue. The audience responded. The camera cut to Ed McMahon, to Doc Severinsen, to the band, and then back to Johnny and Dolly, still talking, still laughing, still performing the intimacy that live television required. When the segment ended, when Dolly stood and waved and walked back through the curtain into the wings, the audience had already decided. She had passed the test. She had been approved by Johnny Carson and therefore by America. The kiss, which could have been a disaster, had become instead a kind of proof that she could handle anything, that she could turn discomfort into charm, that she was not a victim of the culture but a master of it. The curtain hung heavy at the edge of the stage, its burgundy fabric absorbing light, marking the boundary between performance and reality, between the world the cameras saw and the world they did not. Every guest who walked through that curtain understood that they were crossing a threshold, that the person who emerged on the other side had to be a version of themselves that was both true and constructed, authentic and strategic. Dolly Parton understood this better than most. She had been constructing that version of herself since childhood, since the moment she realized that the world would judge her for her appearance, and that she could either resent that judgment or use it. She chose to use it. She chose to become so exaggerated, so visibly constructed, that the construction itself became the art, and the intelligence behind it remained hidden until it was too late to dismiss her. In the decades that followed, the moment would be replayed, discussed, analyzed. Some would see it as innocent, a product of its time, a harmless gesture in an era when such gestures were not yet understood as problematic. Others would see it as an example of the casual violations women endured in professional settings, the way their bodies were treated as public property, the way they were expected to smile and laugh and absorb the discomfort without complaint. Both interpretations contained truth, but what they missed was Dolly Parton's agency, her decision, her refusal to be defined by what happened to her. She had been kissed without permission. She had chosen not to make it a crisis, and in that choice, she had taken control of the story. Johnny Carson never spoke about it publicly with any depth. In his world, the moment had already been resolved. Dolly had laughed, the audience had applauded, the show had continued. There was nothing more to say. But for Dolly, the moment became part of the larger narrative she was building, the story of a woman who looked like a joke and thought like a general, who let the world underestimate her and then quietly took everything she wanted. She would go on to build an empire, music, movies, theme parks, publishing rights, a brand that extended far beyond country music into something closer to American mythology. And every time someone remembered that kiss, they also remembered her smile, her composure, her refusal to be diminished. The microphone still stands in Studio One, though the show has long since moved on, though Johnny Carson has been gone for years, though the culture has shifted in ways that make 1977 feel like a different country. But the microphone remains, and so does the desk, and so does the memory of what it meant to sit in that guest chair, to face that audience, to earn the approval of the man who decided, night after night, what America would laugh at, who America would love. Dolly Parton earned that approval. She earned it by being smarter than the room expected, funnier than her appearance suggested, and resilient enough to turn a moment of discomfort into a moment of triumph. This was not a story about a kiss. It was a story about power, who held it, how it was exercised, and how it could be redirected by someone who understood the game better than anyone assumed. Johnny Carson had the platform. Dolly Parton had the story. And in the end, the story lasts longer than the platform, longer than the applause, longer than the red light on camera 2 that burned steady, and then, eventually, went dark. America trusted Johnny Carson because he never seemed to want too much, because his authority felt accidental, because he wielded power without appearing to grasp for it. But Dolly Parton understood something deeper, that trust could be earned not by hiding ambition, but by making it so visible, so exaggerated that it stopped being threatening and became instead a kind of honesty. She wanted everything. She said so. And because she said it with a smile, because she made it funny, Because she never apologized, America let her have it. The moment passed. The show went on, and somewhere in 30 million living rooms, the evening continued, and no one knew yet that they had just watched a masterclass in survival, in strategy, in the art of being underestimated and emerging victorious. The red light blinked off, the applause faded, and Dolly Parton walked into history, not as the woman who was kissed by Johnny Carson, but as the woman who decided what that kiss would mean.